He used to believe in words. They had been the instruments of his life. Contracts laid in precise clauses, depositions pried open like stubborn shells, a closing argument honed until jurors felt more like judges of truth than mere listeners. In the polished halls of the Dallas bar, Clinton Hale, American-trained, sharp, pragmatic, hair already threaded with silver at 38, wore the law as armor. He reduced the world to definitions, precedents, and the cool arithmetic of culpability. Clients came to him when systems failed them. He won in ways that made other lawyers either admire or quietly resent him. He was not a prosecutor by trade, but when the state needed an expert witness who could lay out the sins of men with surgical clarity, Clinton's testimony often read like an indictment. His family was, for a time, the other instrument he believed in. A small private geometry made of breakfasts at the kitchen island, bedtime stories and voices that turned into songs, and a backyard where their 2 children learned to throw a ball and come back smiling. Isabel, his wife, was a kindergarten teacher at Lakewood Elementary with a laugh like light through glass. Marcus and Lena, 9 and 7, ate cereal in a way that turned mornings into miracles. Clinton protected them with the same exactitude he used in his briefs. He made plans. He believed plans worked. Plans stopped the night his family was taken. Rafael Calderón had been the man on whom Clinton's professional reputation had hinged. Charismatic, brutal, and the sort of person whose smile suggested your life might make good drama. Rafi had built a trafficking network that stretched from the East End warehouses of Houston to the margins of El Paso. Clinton's testimony at the Dallas hearing, detailed, unflinching, and damning, had made headlines. Rafi went away to a state prison. For a moment, it seemed justice had an order to it the way Clinton liked. But the law's order is porous. It depends on human hands and human hearts for enforcement. It relies on prisons to be sealed and on people within them to remain contained. It depends on the fragile belief that you can cut a head from a hydra and the body will not find new mouths to grow. A year later, on a humid November night that smelled of gasoline and dying summer, the Hale house on Belmont Avenue in Lakewood burned. How the first bullet reached Isabel's temple, the way Marcus's small body lay under a collapsed bookshelf, the way Lena's fingers still clutched a frayed stuffed rabbit. These images arrived at once, and with an immediacy that burned through even the neatest of legal frameworks. The authorities called it a targeted attack. They called it gang-related. They called it retaliation. Headlines did not contain the private details, the slow, impossible arithmetic of grief. But Clinton knew them all in a way no one should. Isabel's phone found in a neighbor's yard, a scorched calendar with a single date circled in black, the blood on the tiles that mapped a path from living room to bedroom. Detective Laura Reyes of the Dallas Police Homicide Division arrived on Belmont Avenue that night with the calm of someone who had seen the aftermath of other families' calamities. Reyes was lean, deliberate, and blunt in speech. She had a voice that sounded like gravel and the patience to make facts out of rumor. She told Clinton to let the system work. She said it with the tone of someone trained to keep hope from dissolving into a rash that destroyed more than it healed. Hope was a denatured chemical now. It could not hold. The investigation began in the usual way. Patrol officers secured the property. Arson investigators ran their tests. Reyes ordered interviews, requested phone records, and cataloged evidence with the ritualized care of a professional. Surveillance footage from the cul-de-sac on Belmont was requested. Doorbell cameras from neighbors on the block were collected. The initial lab reports ruled the fire accelerant in. The bullet casings found in the master bedroom were unusual in number and placement. Witnesses, neighbors who said they would call if they saw anything, were timid. Someone reported seeing a dark SUV idling near Abrams Road earlier that evening. A janitor at a nearby office building said he'd heard a muffled argument. Clinton answered the questions with the methodical clarity of a man who had once been paid to parse truth from uncertainty. He signed statements, handed over case files he had kept from the Calderón trial, and watched as officers shuffled the same paper into envelopes. The DA made a public pledge to investigate all connections to Calderón and his network. It was a phrase Clinton heard as though through water. For months, the investigation stalled. Surveillance footage that should have shown the attackers was grainy or missing. A mailbox camera on Mockingbird Lane that might have captured a getaway vehicle had inexplicably gone dark. At 8:14 p.m., witnesses who might have put a face to the guns recanted when their doors began to ring too often. A patrol officer who had been investigating a minor street-level deal in Lakewood was transferred after off-record calls to numbers. The district attorney's office said they were following leads. The word "following" felt as thin as a press release. Rage is a cheap fuel. It burns fast and leaves everything needing tending. Clinton felt the rage in the bone of his jaw. It was not a thing to be filed under evidence. It was a compulsion he could not legislate. He followed the law for a while. He filed motions when he could and requested updates from readers. He used subpoenas when they were appropriate, emails when court orders did not suffice. He visited county records at the clerk's office on Travis County courthouse forms and found himself tracing the Calderón network's lesser accounts. Shell companies registered on Guadalupe Street, LLC filings with addresses that returned P.O. boxes. He talked to men he had once called adversaries and asked them for favors. He leaned on colleagues who owed him. But the state moved like a glacier and grief like a fever. The glacial legal machinery could not satisfy the fever spiking inside his chest. The more he stepped into it, the more it exposed him to bureaucracy that had failed his family. He saw evidence pile up only to be dismissed for the slimmest reasons. A lost warrant, a tampered chain of custody at a suburban holding facility, a prosecutor who needed more than the brittle testimony of a frightened informant. Each failure was another fracture in the scaffolding that held Clinton to the man he had been. And then the first killing happened. It was not in an alley or in the exaggerated theater of a movie. It occurred in a storage unit off Mockingbird Lane. Samuel Slick Sam Ramirez, a courier tied to Calderón whose loose morality and smaller debts had earlier made him a convenient witness, came to meet an anonymous caller. Clinton watched from a distance, parked in a neighbor's driveway that faced the unit, breath fogging the windshield on an October morning as if even the air remembered the fire. He watched the courier bend to pick up a package. His body crumbled. He did not fire a shot. He was a witness in a place that had collapsed the possibility of his former life. At first he wanted justice. Legal, clear, as clean as a signed affidavit. He had once believed the separation between litigant and avenger was a one-way street. That the law would prevent him from walking toward blood as methodically as he had once walked toward a witness stand. But there was also a new, chilling calculation. If the men who had moved to murder his family continued to slip behind legal nets, those nets had to be altered, not only in policy, but in practice. Clinton found that, in the absence of a reliable deliverance from the state, his own hands felt powerless. From that distance, he navigated. He took notes. He cataloged associates and sympathizers. He trained himself to notice things other people passed by. A fresh scar on a hand, a motorcycle parked too long outside a bungalow on Belmont, the nervous habit of tapping a ring against a glass near Navigation Boulevard in Houston. He read patterns of movement, a teller's repeated wire to a Houston dockside account, a mechanic's late-night delivery to a warehouse on Telephone Road, phone pings that jumped the line from downtown Dallas to the East End and back to an El Paso motel on Alameda Avenue. He used paper, not digital tracks. He began to carry small black notebooks, old-fashioned, untraceable in many ways, and filled them with nicknames, sketches of vehicles, license plate fragments, and plans. The notebooks were anathema to a man who had worshipped neat digital trails. He began to meet people who moved between worlds. Ex-convicts who now wash cars in Lakewood, dockhands at Clinton Drive in Houston who had once run small loads for Anthony Vega, an arms financier connected to the Calderón line. He listened in ways he had not before, hearing how fear and resentment braided together into motive. There were stages to his transformation that could be cataloged like a case file. Step 1 was proximity. Get close enough to see who mattered. Step 2 was exposure. Engineer situations where the network would reveal itself. Step 3, where his moral line began to melt. He later called forcing outcomes. That phrase is not in any legal handbook. It was a euphemism Clinton would use in private. as if naming the process could make it smaller. For Clinton, forcing outcomes meant arranging exposures that made men act in ways that left them vulnerable to the law or to their enemies. He did not set out to build an army of assassins. He wasn't a tactician from a war manual. He used the city's existing contradictions, corrupt cops, frightened witnesses, and a human hunger for advantage, like instruments in a brazen symphony. He baited men with dossiers and false promises of asylum. He exploited greed. He softened the edges of lies into truth. He learned which men would talk when pockets were warmed and which would kill before they'd betray a name. He was careful, almost surgical, in this early stage. He would tip a bar fight outside the dockside bar on Clinton Drive in Houston so that an arms broker lost his temper and exposed a connection he had always hidden. He would engineer a chance meeting at a motel on Alameda Avenue in El Paso between a fearful courier and a man he trusted would turn on him when threatened. He used corners of human weakness as a prosecutor uses an admission, as leverage. And yet, in places the public file could never fully record, Clinton crossed lines defined by law. He would later tell a court that there were nights when he held the image of his family in his hands, and it burned him alive. He would tell journalists that he had solicited no man to kill for him. He would say, with a voice that sometimes cracked where legal phrasing had once held firm, that he had indulged in actions that could not be entirely softened by absolution. Because he had been trained to see cause and effect, Clinton knew the legal danger before he stepped. He knew the difference between entrapment and testimony, between blackmail and persuasion. He also knew that men without conscience seldom feared the letter of the law as men like him did. They feared exposure, loss of power, the humiliations that canceled a life of impunity. Expose them enough, he believed, and you could summon punishment without borrowing the exact tools of their trade. The first time he realized he had become something else, he sat in his car on Mockingbird Lane and watched a van pull away from a warehouse. Inside an envelope he had not meant to open, an anonymous packet left at his doorstep with photos and a single scrap of receipt from Navigation Boulevard was a photograph of the man who had been the last to see his family alive. In the reflection of a glass pane within the picture was a second face. Diego El Toro Morales, Calderón's chief enforcer, the same man whose name had been whispered in testimony and threats. For a moment, Clinton felt like a juror with the world's moral compass balanced precariously in his hands. He took his phone out and, instead of calling Reyes first, guided the van away from its usual route and followed. What happened next is hard to reconstruct with the forensic clarity Clinton once demanded. There was a scuffle at the Trinity Commons parking lot, near a diner that sits where Mockingbird meets a service road. A witness reported screams. A man was seen striking another in the head with a blunt object. The assailant was later identified as a stranger. When it ended, a small-time smuggler, someone who had passed through the Calderón network and had been named in Clinton's notebooks, lay with his skull fractured on the curb. Clinton stood over him, not triumphant but emptied, as if the act itself had subtracted from his body the only thing that had been steady inside it, the belief that words could still fix the world. He did not flee. He called Detective Reyes and told her, in the precise language of men who know how a confession needs to be shaped, what had occurred. He said he had found the man and that, in the struggle, the man's head had struck a lamppost. He said he had tried to render aid. He used the same logic he had used in court when he wanted a jury to see nuance. He believed, with the last of his teeth, that the honesty of his telling would save him. The detectives were skeptical. So was Clinton. Evidence is not only made of bodies, but of who stands at the edge of an event and how the community responds. Clinton had allies in the department, officers who had once seen him as an avatar of justice and who now understood the texture of his grief. That does not mean they covered for him entirely. It means some afforded him softness that let ambiguity grow. A blank on a dash cam, a witness who forgot the make of a car, an officer who took a statement but did not push further. Time, luck, and the complications of forensics created gaps that a prosecution would struggle to fill. The killings did not stop. Each leader that Clinton exposed pulled a thread that revealed another leader. One by one, Men with names that had once haunted Clinton's dreams were removed from the equation. Some were exposed and arrested after he funneled evidence to Reyes and to a federal task force in Houston. Some were forced into exile, a sudden relocation out of state that left a dormant shell business behind at an address on Telephone Road. A smaller number, men whose hands were soaked in blood, simply disappeared. When Anthony Vega, the armed smuggler, vanished from a dockside bar on Clinton Drive, leaving a half-drunk bourbon and a chair that rocked as though someone had only just stood, it set a pattern seasoned observers recognized. A war without a declared belligerent had begun. Investigators later pieced together what they could. Calls made from payphones near the East End, meetings at bus stations, a shadow network of informants and ex-cons who had been coaxed into betrayal. They found Clinton's notebooks in a locked compartment behind a false panel in his study. Those notebooks traced one murder to another and held notes on movements and transactions that knit together a picture of a man who had become a curator of consequence. They found emails where Clinton had been a participant in legal maneuvers, filings that pushed the system to act, and threads that suggested his hand in shepherding some arrests. What they could not find was a signed order for execution or an organized network of killers working to his direction. Certainty was in short supply. The media took the pieces and made myth. He was a villain and a vigilante and, for some, a tragic hero. The public split along old axes. One faction saw a man pushed beyond the limits of reason. Another saw a necessary conservation of justice where institutions had failed. Op-eds debated the ethics of private rage in the Sunday Times, and a columnist in Austin wrote about the case as a symptom of a larger legal failure that had metastasized along Guadalupe Street and southward toward the courts. Inside Clinton, change was less legible. He had become a man who existed in the negative space of his life. He kept a photograph of Isabel between 2 pages of an old legal brief and slept in his office at the Lakewood firm sometimes, had on a leather chair that smelled faintly of polish and dust. He drank whiskey at the bar on Mockingbird nights and screamed into pillows sometimes, furious at how the world had allowed him to be hollowed. He saw himself in courtroom mirrors and did not like the stranger wearing his face. Detective Reyes, who had kept the line of investigation open for reasons that mixed professionalism with an odd empathy, watched him unravel and tried sometimes to hold him. Once, in an interview room that was not recording because she had chosen to shut off the cameras out of a petty respect for privacy, she asked him quietly whether he had enjoyed it. He stared at her, and for the first time since the fire, words failed him. The confession, when it came in his private diary years later, would read like a legal brief without its conclusions, an accountant of conscience. "I never enjoyed the blood," he wrote. "I enjoyed the certainty of an outcome. I enjoyed symmetry. Conscience returns in strange ways. It is both heavier and thinner than one expects." As the years pushed on, the network he had set in motion began to twist back on itself. Men he had cultivated turned against others who had once been their liege, and in that violence the city cleaned itself in graduations of hate. In the end, not all the perpetrators were dead. Some sat in cells, eyes blank, speaking sometimes of a clever lawyer who had slipped into their lives and made them feel for the first time the cold breath of consequence. Clinton was eventually brought to trial in Travis County at the courthouse on Guadalupe Street. Judge William Bill Tanner presided, a steady-handed jurist with a tendency to ask questions in a small, exact voice. The prosecution built a case from an accumulation of circumstantial evidence long enough to stitch together a dozen scenes. Phone records showing suspicious pings from a burner phone near the East End and another near Belmont Avenue the night of the fire. A witness who testified that she'd seen him at the Trinity Commons lot. The notebooks, receipts linking last-minute transactions to accounts tied to Navigation Boulevard. A forensic report that tied hair on a glove found in a storage unit to a man in Clinton's orbit. The defense did what great defenders do. It reframed. It argued trauma in the language of mitigation. It called on Clinton's years of service, the cases he had won, the injustices he had earlier exposed. They argued a man who had watched his family die became a person his grief had unmade. They asked the jury to consider not just the acts but the context, a justice system imperfect in the way the law sometimes is, human and fallible and slow. The jury took days to decide what he had been. Jurors who had once admired his cross-examinations sat in a box, now watching him as an accused. They deliberated over moral philosophy, the limits of law, and the possibility that a good man could become a terrible thing. They returned with a verdict that split the difference. Guilty of manslaughter in several counts and conspiracy in others, but acquitted on at least one premeditated murder charge. The sentence was severe, but not definitive enough to satisfy either those who wanted retribution or those who wanted clemency. Prison reduced his life to a smaller geography: concrete walkways and fluorescent lights, the rattle of keys, the slow, tedious economy of hours measured in counts. He read law again in a public library corner, perhaps because he could not stop. He read statutes as a man reads himself. He met inmates whose stories he had once helped with legal filings. He met those he had once opposed. A young man named Isaac, the son of a woman Clinton had defended in an unrelated custody battle, visited the prison library. Isaac listened to Clinton teach law with awkward reverence and a tenderness that baffled the men who saw it. For Clinton, teaching was a way to keep some part of the old faith alive. Words could mean something. Outside, the Calderón network never fully recovered. It lost men, power, and the sleekness with which it had once moved. Some of the gang's surviving members took up new trades. Some left town. Families of men Clinton had pursued rose in litigation. Arguing state complicity had left a man to his own devices. The public remained split. Years later, in an op-ed, Detective Reyes admitted she had been both confounded and sympathetic. Policing a city means sometimes accepting you cannot fix everything. At a parole hearing years later, he read from a prepared statement. He said he had been a lawyer who loved words, and that he had become a man who watched words fail him when they mattered most. He apologized freely for the things he had done. He asked for mercy not as a legal gambit, but as a human plea. Whether the parole board accepted his plea becomes just another line in the ledger of a life that had been split by a single violent fulcrum. What matters more is how the apology landed. For a man who had once disassembled arguments and people with equal calm, issuing an unadorned apology was harder than any closing he had given. It was not designed to persuade a jury. It was designed to let him keep living with the knowledge that something like a man remained. There are no tidy answers at the end of this story. There are no elegant dualities. Clinton became a killer, yes, but he also remained, in other registers, the lawyer who once argued for the small soul of a bus driver or represented a battered mother without charge. He did damage. He also repaired what the law had failed to secure in slivers. A courier arrested after he tipped the DA, a weapons shipment interrupted at the Houston ship channel thanks to a document he leaked. He wrote good contracts and bad confessions. He was both instrument and consequence. True crime as a genre loves clarity, a neat villain, a clean arrest, a satisfying conviction. Clinton's tale resists such simplicity. It is messy because life is messy. His family was destroyed by men who believed themselves exempt from consequence. The law failed to protect those who needed it most. Clinton's response, the orchestration, the brutality, the moral slippage, killed in the name of a raw, human hunger for balance. The city recovered its surface. The wounds beneath remained. Years later, when people asked what had composed the man who had become both solver and destroyer, they pointed to a sequence of failures. Prisons that are porous, witnesses who are scared, and institutions that are sometimes more allied to procedure than to people. Others pointed to a simpler, colder truth. Rage makes architects of men who were once docile. On a winter evening, some years down the road, a small plaque at the edge of a cemetery read simply, Isabel Hale, Marcus Hale, Lena Hale, gone. People left flowers and notes and legal forms that had never been filed. Near the plaque, a man, older, hair whiter than in photographs that once hung in courtrooms, stood with hands in his pockets, watching the space where his family's names rested in stone. He did not stoop to lay flowers. He did not speak. He stood and let the wind take the sound of his breath and the shape of his regret. Clinton had once believed in words. In the end, he learned the cruelty of their insufficiency. He learned that some failures cannot be remedied solely through precedent, that the human heart sometimes demands a reckoning the law cannot give. He learned, too late, that taking the law into one's hands is to shape the world to a private justice that leaves scars longer than any sentence.